So Howard, right now we're live. We're Supply Chain Explained, brand new YouTube channel podcast where are going to explain different supply chains about all kinds of different scenarios all around the world. And right now we want to think about the impact of geopolitical events on supply chain resilience. So Howard, you and I have been talking about this topic for a while now, and you brought up an article that I thought was really interesting about the beverage industry and a concern that they have with their supply chain. Why don't you elaborate on that a little bit, and then you and I can have a kind of a conversation about it.
Cool. Sounds good. Hey guys, me again, Howard. So, one of the key things we're talking about, and I'd like to discuss with y'all right now, is the Sudan conflict. I'm sure a lot of us have been hearing about it. It's all over the news, it's all over the internet, it's all over LinkedIn. But, there's a big conflict going on right now in Sudan. It's terrible. Thousands of lives are being lost. There's a war going on, and it's really affecting supply chains. We'll go over the details of this event a little bit more in detail so you understand what's going on in Sudan. But right now, there's a war going on there. All of supplies are being cut off, and one of the key ingredients, 80% of it that comes out of Sudan is gum arabic, and one of the main ingredients for soda.
Soda, you mean like beverages, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, all
See,
that kind
yep.
of things?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
fizzy
interesting.
drinks. Yep. Pop,
Oh, okay.
soda, whatever part of the country you're from, however you
And what
call it.
pop, that's the one. Pop.
That's
You
right.
get your pop. What do you mean pop? In the South we call it Coke. What do you mean I want a Coke? And then you go to a restaurant and you say, I want a Coke. They're gonna ask you what kind. If you go to California, for example, I want a Coke, they'll say, okay, they'll give you a
You
Coca-Cola.
go, yeah.
you know. So you mentioned that 80% of the world supply of soda gum Arabic is comes from Sudan.
Yep. Oh yeah. And so this is a specific type of gum arabic. There's different types. They're using like paints, for example. They're using M&Ms for candies, for glues, cosmetics. But the main issue on this one is that this high quality gum arabic that comes mainly from Sudan, that is used in soft drinks, basically as a binding agent for all of the different ingredients that are in Coke and Pepsi, any kind of fizzy drink, actually. It needs to be high quality. And there's a big issue with that now for Pepsi and Coke because, as we are just talking about, there's this big war going on right now in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces, who is under Hemeti, nicknamed Hemeti, who's their general, and then also Al Burhan, who's part of the Sudan army. So there's a big power struggle right now. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of conflict going on. The ports are closed. Actually, yesterday, fun fact too. Well, not fun fact, but they were supposed to have some kind of ceasefire yesterday. That didn't happen, so the fighting is continuing. These ports are now clogged up because they're prioritizing getting people out. So they're having a real hard time right now, or actually impossible to get any kind of gum arabic. So imagine that, right? For Pepsi and Coke, that's your main material. It can only come from Sudan. It creates such an big issue, an issue or an event that's halfway across the globe in Africa is now can affect and has the potential to affect the sales for Pepsi and Coke, these American companies making all this Coke, from all over the world, actually. And, it's just a prime example depicting how a current event, all, like I said, all the way across, halfway across the world, can impact your supply chain here because that's where the product originates.
So so is this something that's new to Pepsi and Coke? Is this something that they did not expect, or is this something that's just always been in the background? In other words, the conflict in Sudan, the issues in Sudan.
Yeah, so going back to that, the history of Sudan, it says since the 80s, even slightly before that, they've been in civil wars from, I remember, two to three different civil wars. So this has been an ongoing thing. Sudan has always been pretty unstable. So Coke and Pepsi understand this, right? And this we got to go back to also supply chain strategies is important about that.
Right.
They
Yeah.
understand that and they know that. So they have about, from what I've been seeing online, 6 to 8. It's been reported difference about roughly about 6 to 8 months of supply that a lot of these soft drink manufacturers are holding right now.
Okay. So they're adapting or adopting a strategy similar to the textile industry that we talked about earlier in the year when we talked about clothing and textiles, where the textile industry was stockpiling supplies in warehouses because they anticipated strikes in the port and they were basically getting tired of their Christmas stuff being held
Oh yeah.
hostage during a labor dispute, because the people on the ports and the docks knew as well. It's like, oh yeah, well, if they don't get this stuff off the dock, then they don't make their profits.
Oh
So
yeah.
they've been stockpiling it so that they don't have to worry about it. It's like, oh yeah, well, we can do that. So it sounds like that Coke and Pepsi are doing similar types of strategies. What are
Oh
some
yeah.
other things they might be doing that to mitigate the impact of something like this?
I'm
Are there
sure they're
any?
I'm sure they're probably trying to figure out how to get a different material now, or get
Mm,
different ingredient. Other, I'm sure they've been trying to do that, but like I said, it's a high quality that they need to be able to stick all those ingredients together. So that may be difficult to do. I'm not an expert in that, but that's definitely an option. Try to find alternate sort or alternate
okay,
material and find alternate sources of supply. You said I said 80%. There's another 20 somewhere else. They can resource it somewhere else. I also read though that like for the paints and glues and the paint stuff like that, having the high quality gum arabic isn't necessary. So a lot of
okay,
those have shifted to other areas where they can get the lower quality. Unfortunately, like I said, Pepsi and Coke do not have that opportunity. But going back to what your question is though, having safety stock, but also understanding, right? As we talk about, always going back to mapping your supply chain. If you understand the geopolitics that are going on in that specific area that you mapped out, you understand how critical it is to have 6 to 8 months of supply. If you think about a normal manufacturing facility or anywhere like that, 6 to 8 months of in safety stock, that ain't flying. But if you
right.
can justify it, right, and demonstrate why it is needed, then it's more understandable. And they're probably really happy. I know they're happy right now that they actually have that 6 to 8 months of supply.
So this is counter to the just-in-time model that was so prevalent,
Oh yeah.
just 5 or 6 years ago, where everyone was kind of saying just in time. They didn't want to hold stock. They were getting rid of their warehousing space. It's like, okay, well, my supplier will hold that. So the impact of the pandemic and other geopolitical events are forcing companies to really reconsider this just-in-time strategy and think more about stockpiling. And then you mentioned alternative sources or alternative ingredients, thinking about that. So when it comes to Sudan, one of the things I read, the conflict's one issue that's kind of immediate and in the media. But is
Yeah.
that really the big issue as far as this particular ingredient coming out of Sudan? What about the labor force that harvests this ingredient? What does that look like? Is that a deeper issue that may go beyond this conflict?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a great point. So, say about 60%, from what I remember, is actually employed for that gum arabic market. Right, that's one of the major forms of GDP out of Sudan. Right, it's unique to that area. Plant the trees only grow in that area, so that's their main form of employment. So now with all this going on, right, with all this conflict going on and everybody fleeing to like South Sudan, for example, going to other different countries where they feel safe, right? And you're going to lose all that workforce. You're going to lose all that
Right.
experience. You're going to, all that skilled labor, ever to level of skill that is needed to get the sap from the gum arabic. So there's also that big part, right? They're going to lose that knowledge, just like Ukraine and Russia. A lot of Russians also
That's
fled
right.
from Russia, and now they lost a lot of that talent. They lost a lot of like for example, for tech industry, they had a good amount of Russian that were tech based, and they
Right.
left.
So it's the one that the labor force is retreating. But now let's say when all that labor force comes back, one of the things I was noticing, or when I was reading and researching to prepare for our conversation today,
Oh,
there's
you did.
a demographic. Yeah, I did prepare a little bit. But there's a demographic issue in regards to age, right? The older workforce is there. They're getting older. They can't quite do the work
Yeah, they can't.
anymore. And then the younger workforce does have basically has no interest in doing this work. It's hard. It's hot. It's
Yeah, I can
muggy.
blame
It's not something that they want to do. So they don't see the value in investing in this trade to continue to harvest this key ingredient, not only
you.
for beverages, which is, something that people talk about, Pepsi and Coca-Cola and other soft drinks using it, but pharmaceuticals, other binding or things that need binding agents. This is a key part of that
Yep.
to work and make it work. So what are your thoughts in regards to an aging demographic?
Yeah, no, that's also interesting to hear, right? Going just with the aging and also the fleeing. If you think about now, your source of supply is going to slowly start to evaporate. Either that or the capacity is going to be drastically reduced. So
Right.
even if you have a safety stock, right, and you get, and say the war stops and the conflict stops and you have a ceasefire, who's going to be producing that new amount? Who's going to get that capacity
Right.
back in operate? It's probably never going to ever be the same. So now Pepsi and Coke now have a unique other issue of where now they're not going to be able to get the stuff they need fast enough to continue to pump out. So you think about it too, a lot of the demand around the world isn't going to stop because there's a war in Sudan. People aren't going to stop drinking soda because there's a war in Sudan.
That's right.
It's just going to continue to be the same. The demand curve is still going to continue to stay the same or increase, while the capacity constraints are going to decrease. So you got a big problem on your hand.
Right. And then, so once Coke and Pepsi lose customers, how hard is it to get them back?
Oh, yeah, probably near impossible, right?
Yeah. And then the
Go to
other
water,
question,
maybe.
water or but how many different types of drinks are out there right now, right? How
Yep.
many different types of beverages, the new energy drinks that people are looking at, is this a key ingredient there? That's something I always like to ask. And so what? So what if we can't get Coke and Pepsi? How does that impact my survival as a human? It's like,
Doesn't.
okay, it doesn't, and no big deal. As hard as it may be, but there's deeper, I think, deeper economic impact here. And just as you were alluding to from the demographics, that you have a workforce built up, there's money flowing into a country. That when that money stops, then what does that country have to do? They have to find alternate sources of revenue to work through that. and
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 that's
Randy, I would like to talk about that too a little bit with Sudan. So
yeah.
that's one of the big issues too, is the power struggle. A lot of it too, though, especially from the Rapid Support Forces by
Mhm.
Hemeti, a lot of that was based upon like gold and a lot of dealing with Russians sending illegal gold to gold mines, attacking gold mines, to taking natural resources, to doing a lot of bribing. That's kind of the way the RSF started doing. It's kind of like a little
Okay.
criminal organization. So that kind of created issues in Sudan.
Right. So I mean, we call it bribery, we call it criminal, we believe it through our culture and our ethics based on how we were raised. So it brings up a great concern when we think about our culture over here and that culture over there. Is that
Yep.
really a bad thing? Because that's kind of how they do
They do
business, right?
business, yeah.
That's just, bribery. Just hey, we call it bribery. They call it, if you want my business, you better pay me to get my business. You know, and that's just kind of how things work. And
Well,
but
interesting
they're
though, going back to the gold thing though, Randy, right? And so what happened when Sudan split into South Sudan
okay,
after the Civil War, they took 70% of the gold out of Sudan. Now South Sudan has 70% of the gold
okay,
reserves. That created this big issue in Sudan now because now, right, that was one of their main forms of income or GDP to get money in. So now you don't have the gold that you need. And
right.
now the country, now you got all this inflation, all these issues, currency issues. So all of this started to explode. And that's why you're starting to see that now with
Right.
the current power grabs with the rapid support forces and then also the Sudan army. Now they're really fighting for control.
Interesting. So we now, like, gold is one thing, the means of value, another means of export to bring more money into the country. What are some other issues going on in Sudan? Sour gums one, gold's another. What are some other things that people need to be concerned about? How does this affect other countries in this area?
Yeah, there's so that big belt, right? It's so there's also like Chad is another
Mhm.
country there that's being
Okay.
affected like this. A lot of the fighting was usually away from Sudan, out of um, the actual capital of Sudan. Now the fighting is within Sudan. They even got the Sudan army is now even bombing. So,
That's
right.
right.
So there's a lot of structural damage as well. And going back to your question,
Okay. Yeah.
this is also a big concern, right? Is how they're going to distribute all this stuff, how they're logistically, even if they could, right, go back to the capacity thing. Not only now is their capacity now down, their ability to produce as much, also now their ability to distribute. Who knows how their ports are doing, and then also, right, going back to the talent thing, the talent gap, and trying to get the workforce be able to produce that. So
Mhm.
there's this is a compiling issue that's going on now.
So, from a supply chain professional point of view and how we need to look at our own specific categories, this is a great case study in
Yep, yep.
regards to resilience. You got a labor force issue, you got a geopolitical issue, you've got infrastructure issue, you've got a
Right.
supply issue, alternate supplies, and looking at that. So, when we start to look at things from a resilience point of view, how can we draw lessons learned from this situation and apply it to our own category management that we are specifically focused on in our world as supply chain professionals? What are your thoughts on that?
So I remember I'm still thinking about that one comment you said about price and cost, right? There is a cost to resilience. But this case really shows how important it is to spend that money, especially on your primary ingredient, right? Gum arabic,
Right.
right? Just to develop your suppliers, right? To make sure that you have secondary, tertiary sources of supply, that you have alternate supply if you need to, right? Going back to the this needed to be the primary, the high quality gum arabic that Coke and Pepsi needs, right? So that's another big lesson there, is that you need to take the time, spend a little bit of that money to make sure that when there's an issue, that you're able to quickly shift, right? We can't have supply chains now that are very rigid and strict. And this is the one person we're going to, this is this one supplier we're going to use constantly. And that's it, right? They're not going to always be reliable, right? It's not if, but when something happens that will impact your
Right.
supply chain. Going back to the statement about being halfway around the world, right? This is a great example of that again. And going back to the taking lessons out, right?
Yeah.
Being able to one of the key things that I always talk about and say is that you need to be able to tie your geopolitical issues to your supply chain. Now more than that's more important now more than ever, which I
Yeah.
talk about in my book, by the way, Secrets to an Unbreakable Supply Chain.
Hey,
I
there we
talk
go.
about I talk about this a lot in there, and I learned a lot of this from the military, right? Oh, nice book, by the way.
Yeah, we'll talk about that towards the end. Yep.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
but so we talk about this is a big part that I've learned in the military, right? You need to be able to be up to date with geopolitical issues
Mhm.
because it can impact your supply chain, and this is a prime example of that. So if Pepsi and Coke weren't aware of this, that their gum arabic was coming from Sudan and that it was an unstable country, an unstable region, and they didn't have that 7 to 8 months of supply or buffer stock available, they would be in a way worse situation than they are now,
Right.
right? And on top of that, imagine when they did notice and this issue started brewing up, right? Who was the first, Coke or Pepsi, to react and take whatever
Right.
was left?
He who knows first moves first, should move
Yep.
first, right?
That's right. And
So they
and
have that.
COVID really showed this. We talk about
Right.
the COVID because it's such an example. But like whoever was quick to shift and get whatever limited supply was left, they took it. And
Yeah.
when you have that foresight to understand that there's an issue brewing up, because you never think geopolitical and supply chain, yeah, that kind of goes hand in hand. But man, now more than ever, with the way the world is, seems like after COVID, everybody just went their own separate ways, right? Global supply
Right.
chain, and you need to really understand that, right? And that also will impact your strategies as well, right? Do you need to reshore, near shore, maybe go to like Mexico or Canada instead, right? Maybe not in the U.S. But this also brings up that issue as well.
And all that stuff takes time.
Yeah.
So that's, and who knows the category best other than the category manager. So you have, your category managers, your buyers, category managers, your directors, all the way up to vice president of supply chain. And you and I mentioned this before, is that we may consider a low level person in the supply chain organization has such a huge impact
Oh yeah.
on the organization because that buyer sees when prices start to tick up, right? Because
That's
they're
right.
dealing with their suppliers and they're should be asking questions why. And we mentioned before in a webinar we did earlier this year about the 8 elements of supply chain as part of the resilience effort. If we were to look back at this particular situation, what are the 8 elements that we could look at, or not? We talk about different ones, but how those elements should a company like Coke or Pepsi look at different elements to monitor their supply chain? And we want to use like this case study to see what we should be doing as category managers, right? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, this is what they did, and what supply chain intelligence am I gathering for my categories? And so that I am consistently monitoring so I can recognize when there's a geopolitical issue that's going to affect my category. And you're probably one of 10 100 category managers in a large organization, you being the royal you. So when you think about monitoring the supply chain that for this situation, what would be some of the elements you would look at and monitor, specific elements, and how would you gather that information?
Well, the big one now too is political and military. Going back to
Right.
my book, discussed that in my book. That is one of the 8 elements. But military, when I wrote the book, it wasn't such a big deal, right? It is definitely one of the areas, especially in the military, that we always look at political and military impacts to our operational environment. And those are the two biggest ones right now, especially going around all the world with China and Russia and North Korea and everything. I don't think you probably have any suppliers in North Korea, but just how North Korea's actions can impact other areas, South Korea for one, right? But those are two definitely big ones. And one of the things I suggest that you can do is also go to the State Department website. They
Okay.
give you active, real world information on how, what is the, what is the, how is the US and that specific country, how are they dealing with each other, right? How
Okay.
is their relationship? And so if this a country like Sudan, you go to the State Department website, it'll tell you that it's very unstable, that they have conflict still going on, that they have an unstable government. There actually is no government. It's the military right now. Going back to that, right? Al Burhan, who's the Sudan um, army general, he actually, right? So it just goes back to that, and understand that you can have impacts like that, and the military can definitely have big impacts. And I can see that now going on from here on out. Military impacts is going to be such a major player as China, right, with Taiwan, with Russia and Ukraine, and then now with Sudan, right? There's a lot more of these military issues coming up that people that we're not used to pre-COVID, right? We're not used to that kind of stuff, or that was never on our mind to think, right? How can the potential military conflict affect our supply chains? But yet it happens over and over again.
So let's dig a little bit more into the military impacting a supply chain. Yes, we have the conflict, we have the conflict, but then I think when military has conflict, they become the priority within that supply chain. And you mentioned before infrastructure, ports, where those ports are no longer focused on exports of soda gum or gum
Yeah.
arabic out. And now they're looking at importing military products to support that conflict, right?
Oh yeah.
When we think about military, the conflict's what we hear about in the media, but then it just, that military becomes the priority within the supply chain. So then those other things get pushed aside. So you may have an order due in, but all of a sudden your order is second or third or fourth in the line or priority order
Priority.
because
Yeah.
the military has now a higher priority than what you did. So if we were to think about having the 8 elements, right, and mapping it, what a key thing people need to know is, well, where are my concerns from a geopolitical nature? That means they need to map their supply
Supply
chain
chain. Yeah.
all the way down to the raw materials. I know you and I have talked about that before because you discuss it in your book. What would be something, how would they do that in this particular situation?
For gum Arabic.
Yeah, gum arabic. How do we map that back? How, when you and I were preparing for this conversation and realizing that we have a industry in the United States or a global beverage industry and mapping it all the way down to the raw production of a key ingredient that supports that entire
Yeah.
industry, you know.
Well, one thing you can do is definitely reach out to your suppliers, right? So for us, and I know a lot of in medical industry and a lot of other industries where traceability is also important, we have PO packages that come with our actual orders. So it has, right, who did the heat treat, who made the nut and bolt for this part, right, who did this and who did that, what suppliers were used for different processes or for different parts. So that's one way you could trace it all the way down. It's just a lot of people don't take the time to look at the information that they have. It's never
Right.
thought in their mind to take the time to actually dig down deeper and deeper and deeper. Right. One, like I said, you can ask your supplier. Hey, they would,
Mhm.
most would be happy to help and share that information with you so that you just say, it's from a resilient standpoint. I'm trying to understand, where all of my materials come from, right? Maybe prioritize your most critical component or just prioritize one component that impacts majority of your, a lot of your programs or a lot of your parts, and start drilling it down to see where exactly it came from. Right. So, and also you can
Yeah.
also do research online. Google is a great tool that we all nice to use. Right.
Right,
So
right.
yeah, there's many different ways.
And you mentioned time. How long does this really take? How long does it take to map a supply chain?
What, 30 minutes, an hour, maybe?
Maybe an hour. And with the advent of ChatGPT and these other AI tools, it can help you get a head start, right? You can
That's
go
right.
in, tap in, say, hey, give me the supply chain. I need to understand my supply chain of my category from customers to raw materials. Give me an outline. And then the
Or actually
AI would
explain the
pull it,
processes for this, right? For turning
right?
this to that, right? And then it'll give you that, and then you can start chasing it down. So yeah, there's
Yeah.
tons of tools out there.
Now, but just let's talk about AI for a minute. This is where AI cannot replace a human because a human has to understand the information coming out of the bot, right? So that you have to know what questions to ask and then be able to understand the information coming out of the machine to know if it's real or not, if it makes sense, and be able to then take that information coming out of the machine and do further research to validate the information that the machine is spitting out. I just want to bring that up because AI, oh, AI, all this, ooh, scary stuff. But I see it as more of a tool that can be leveraged, not a replacement for humans, so long as the humans are aware of their value and the thought process, the critical thinking piece. Now, how do you feel about AI? Just kind of a side note. I mean, it just popped up that
Well, I think it can be definitely helpful, but one of the things the issues that I see is that it's from 2021, and especially like Chat GPT, right? It's not the most up to date information. Maybe the AI will be able to do that in the future, but right now it looks at past information, and it's also not as creative as a human mind, right? It can't take in all aspects or considerations like a human can, right? It may be more just literal A and B, one plus one, and humans don't necessarily think that exact way, right? And also the relationships, because we also still need that human relationship side, right? You can send a purchase order over, right? But when it comes to managing your open orders, to managing all of your supply, you need to also be able to have that relationship, and that's also important for supply chain resilience. So make
right.
sure that you have strong relationships with your suppliers, so that when an issue comes up, right, you know that they'll be there for you, and
And they can give you intel, right? With
of
that
course,
relationship, they'll feed you information if you have a good relationship.
yeah, and give you
So
an early warning too. If something's coming
that's
up,
right.
they say, "Hey, I'm starting to see prices go up, and we're starting to run out of this a lot." You're a great customer of mine. I'm just giving you a heads up. This
Right.
is what's happening. That's what a lot of my suppliers do. They give me a heads up if they're seeing something like, "Hey, lead times are going through the roof." I try to give you the best price, but your lead times to the roof. Here are the issues. Why? This is what I'm seeing. Right? You can keep going more down the chain, further away from you, more tiers down, and then you get more
Right.
intel, more information.
Okay. Well, it's been a pretty good conversation and kind of demonstrating resilience and using a current case study, a current thing that's going on right now. So if folks want to learn more about supply chain resilience, basically, how should they contact you? What's the best way to do that?
Well, first way is to go to my LinkedIn, so Howard Knapp, CPSM, HOWARD, KNAPP, CPSM. And then also visit my website. I have a bunch of free material on there, hnap.com. Go to my website. The link's also on there if you want to get to it. But I have my books on sale there. I have a lot of free content on there. I put, you can also sign up for a free chapter in my book to get more continued newsletters, to get more information. So, yeah, go there and visit me. Best investment you make.
You mentioned your book. I'm going to show a cover of your book, but maybe explain more value or the way people will gain value by looking and learning more about this book.
Sure. So, the one thing I wanted to do with this book is to create actionable tips, things that you can do for free or not for free, how to strategies, right? Things that you can apply to see immediate results or, get pretty good results. So that's how my book is. It's basically a how-to guide on how to approach different parts of supply chain resilience, from logistics, inventory management to procurement. And I hit a lot of the different areas that are important for making sure that your supply chain is running correctly. So you want a good, helpful read. You don't want any of the BS. You just want the straightforward. What are the things I need to know? Why is it important? And how can I apply it? This is the book for you.
How to action guide, actionable
That's right.
information, immediate value once you get that. And just to validate that value, make sure you go to hnap.com and download that free chapter and just see how much value you can gain from, listening and
Unlimited.
learning. learning from HNAP, learning from HNAP, learning from Howard, so that you can expand. And this is important stuff, folks. You need to think about category management, supply chain professionals, and whether you're in the supply chain career field or not, every single one of us is affected by the supply chain. So you need to understand your supply chain and whatever expertise or whatever field you're in, all the way down to the raw materials. So when you listen to the news and you hear about these geopolitical events, you're like, how does this impact me? And you'd have talked about Russia and Ukraine, the China impact. We did the microchip war. We discussed that earlier this year as well. These are all different ways that you just need to pay attention and know what's going on out there.
Yep.
So, for folks, I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. Make sure you reach out to Howard on LinkedIn, connect with him, and free information is always good information, and it can help you save your butt when things are going wrong.
That's
And
right.
the thing is that you don't know it until you know it, and just like the pandemic caught everyone off the guard, that was your buy, that was your alibi to not be prepared for a supply chain situation. Now everyone knows better. You need to know better. All
That's
right.
right.
Thank you, Michelle, Melissa. I really appreciate letting us know that you think this is an excellent presentation. Thank you today. And for everyone else, have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you soon.